In the movies, justice in the Old West was simple. They caught the outlaw, held the trial, and carried out the sentence. But the records tell a different story. There were lynchings without trial, hangings that dragged the agony out for 20 minutes in front of the crowd, and 14-year-old boys punished like grown men. The following 22 facts show what no one told you in school. Number 1. Justice. That didn't wait for a judge or jury. More than 2,000 recorded cases. Imagine living in a small town where there's no sheriff, no courthouse, no nothing. Someone steals a horse or gets accused of killing another man. What happens? The people themselves solve the problem. And solving it back then meant only one thing: rope and a tree. Between 1865 and 1900, lynching worked as the #1 justice system across much of the West and the South of the United States. It wasn't the exception. It was the rule. The Tuskegee Institute managed to document more than 2,000 cases between 1882 and 1900 alone. But here's the chilling detail. Those are only the cases someone bothered to write down. In isolated territories, many deaths showed up in the records as unknown causes, or simply didn't show up at all. Now here's the fact that really hits hard. Historians who studied these cases in depth estimate that between 30 and 40% of the people lynched were innocent. They hadn't committed any crime at all. All it took was an accusation, a rumor, and that was it. The crowd decided and carried out the execution on the same day. No proof, no defense, no way back. Number 2. Mutilation as a warning was a documented practice. When we think of the Old West, we picture shootouts and duels, but the reality was far more brutal than any movie ever showed. In places like Texas and New Mexico, between 1870 and 1880, there was a code of violence that worked like a system of communication. With no reliable courts and no telegraph across much of the territory, people created their own ways to send messages. And those messages were written on the bodies of the victims. During the so-called range wars, rival ranchers didn't just steal each other's cattle. They cut off the ears of their opponents' animals and left them as a warning on fences. But it didn't stop with the animals. Workers captured on disputed land sometimes got the same treatment. Criminal groups that controlled certain areas mutilated suspected traitors and purposely let them go alive. The idea wasn't to kill, it was to turn the person into a walking warning. Anyone who saw that disfigured man understood the message without needing a single word. It was a language of power in a land where the law simply didn't reach. Number 3. Whippings as legal punishment in the Old West. This is something very few people know. In several Old West territories, whippings on the back weren't abuse. They were an official sentence. Local judges could order lashes as punishment for minor crimes, and it was within the law. But what happened far from the courts was even worse. In silver mines and railroad camps, companies made their own rules, and anyone who disobeyed paid with their body. Foremen whipped workers for any internal violation. Being late, disobedience, trying to leave before the contract ended. Everything became a reason. And here's the detail no one tells you in school books. If you were Chinese building the railroad, Mexican in a mine, or black in any of those operations, there was simply nowhere to complain. No court would accept a worker's complaint against a boss in those territories. The company was the law. The foreman was the judge. And the whip was the sentence. This kept happening until the late 1800s without anyone being held responsible. Number 4. Public hangings were community events with admission. This is going to shock you, but it was completely normal back then. When someone was sentenced to hang in the Old West, the execution didn't happen quietly in some random corner. It was the opposite. The sheriff announced the date in local newspapers weeks in advance, as if it were a county fair. People came from nearby towns just to watch. Entire families showed up, including children. In some counties, the sheriff himself sold spots closer to the gallows as a way to raise money for the local government. Street vendors set up stands around the area, selling food and drinks to the crowd that gathered. The next day, newspapers published detailed accounts of everything that happened, including the condemned person's last words. The official justification was simple: to show the public what happened to anyone who crossed the line of the law. In practice, it had become a social event where people met up and caught up with each other while waiting for the main moment. Number 5. In the 19th century, the gallows was considered a quick method. The idea was simple: the drop would break the neck, and death would come within seconds. But there was one serious problem. Most sheriffs who carried out executions in the Old West had no training at all to calculate the right length of the rope. And that detail changed everything. If the rope was too short, the neck didn't break. The condemned person stayed hanging there, conscious, slowly suffocating for 5, 10, even 20 minutes. The crowd that came to watch ended up witnessing something no one expected to see. Now, if the rope was too long, the result was the opposite, and just as disturbing. The force of the drop separated the head from the body. Newspapers at the time didn't hold back on the details when describing these episodes. They published full accounts as part of the event coverage, with no censorship at all. What was supposed to be a calculated execution turned into an unpredictable spectacle. And the most shocking part is that this didn't happen rarely. It was a recurring problem that kept happening for decades. Number 6. In San Francisco in 856, a group of merchants and businessmen decided that the official law wasn't working. They formed what they called the Committee of Vigilance. And here's the detail that catches most people by surprise: they didn't hide. They published the trials in the city's newspapers and executed the condemned in front of everyone in a public square, as if it were an official event. A few years later, in Montana, something even more disturbing happened. The Virginia City Committee of Vigilance hanged at least 22 men in just 6 weeks, between 1863 and 1864. And one of the men hanged was none other than the town sheriff himself, Henry Plummer, accused of leading a gang of road agents. Think about that for a second. The man who was supposed to represent the law was tried and executed by civilians. And these civilians weren't outlaws or desperate people. They were the richest and most influential men in those communities, which gave these committees a kind of power no elected authority could challenge at the time. Number 7. A law that basically authorized violence against Asian workers. In 1854, California passed a law about evidence in court, and that law said the following: Chinese, black, and indigenous people could not testify in cases involving a white man. Think about that for a second. If a Chinese worker was beaten by a white American, and there were 20 Chinese witnesses standing right there, not one of them could open their mouth in court. The judge simply wouldn't accept it. Without valid testimony, there was no way to build a case. And without a case, there was no trial, no punishment, no nothing. In practice, this meant that any white person could do whatever they wanted to, a Chinese worker, and walk away like nothing had happened. And everyone knew it. In mining camps, on farms, on railroad construction sites, this rule was known. Chinese workers knew they were unprotected, and anyone who wanted to take advantage of that knew it too. The law didn't need to explicitly say that violence was allowed. All it had to do was remove any possibility of justice. Number 8. Have you ever heard of tarring and feathering? Yeah, this practice was much more common than history books usually show. And the detail very few people know is that in most cases, it had nothing to do with crime. It was a punishment carried out by mobs against people who simply thought differently. Anyone who defended the end of slavery in the South, supported unions in mining regions, or had relationships the local community didn't approve of could end up becoming a target. The process was brutal. The victim was held down by force while hot tar was poured over their body. Then feathers were thrown on, sticking to the burned skin. The burns were serious, and removing the tar afterward was just as painful as applying it. Many victims were left with marks for the rest of their lives. The most disturbing part is that this didn't happen in secret. It was done in public squares, with an audience, as a warning to anyone who thought about challenging that community's rules. It wasn't justice, it was organized intimidation, disguised as punishment. Number 9. Private justice in the mines. This is going to surprise you. Inside mining properties, the law of the country simply didn't exist. The person in charge was the mine manager. Period. The big companies created their own trial systems, completely separate from any court or civil authority. If a worker was accused of stealing ore, for example, he was taken to a kind of court set up by the company itself. There was no lawyer, no defense, no appeal. The manager decided the man's fate right there. The punishments ranged from being fired on the spot to being kicked off the property, and in many cases, physical punishment. The most shocking part is that no one hid this. It was all done openly because there was simply no law stopping the company from acting that way. The government didn't inspect, the police didn't enter, and the official courts had no jurisdiction in that territory. In practice, each mine worked like a small independent country where the manager's word mattered more than any constitution. And any worker who disagreed already knew where the door was. Number 10. The concept of innocent, until proven guilty, didn't functionally exist. The American Constitution already guaranteed that every citizen was innocent until proven guilty. Beautiful on paper. But in Old West courts, that rule almost never worked in practice. When a crime happened in a small town and people got outraged, the accused walked into the trial already condemned in everyone's mind. He wasn't treated as an innocent person waiting for judgment. He was treated as a guilty man trying to save himself. It was up to him to prove he hadn't done anything, not up to the prosecutor to prove that he had. Jurors were neighbors of the victim. Witnesses changed their statements depending on community pressure, and judges knew that going against public sentiment could cost them their jobs. And that was in the cases that actually made it to court. Because in many situations, the crowd didn't even wait for a trial. Lynchings happened before any investigation. The mob decided who was guilty, tied the rope, and ended the matter. The formal system was better than that, no doubt, but it was far from what the country's founders had planned when they wrote that Constitution. Number 11. The cattle branding iron had another use that very few people know about today. In the territories of Texas and New Mexico, during the 1860s and 1870s, that same iron was used on people. When a cattle thief was caught, ranchers didn't wait for a trial. They heated the iron with the initial of the stolen ranch and branded the man. It could be on the face, the forehead, or the back of the hand. It was a punishment that went beyond the pain of the moment. That scar told a story to anyone who looked at it. Everyone knew what that mark meant. And here's the detail that really mattered. A man branded that way was basically finished in the Old West. No ranch would hire someone carrying that sign on his skin. Back then, working with cattle was practically the only way to make a living in those territories. So the brand wasn't just a physical punishment, it was a sentence. The man was left unable to get work, trusted by no one, with no chance to start over. A piece of hot iron destroyed a man's life permanently. Number 12. Children were tried as adults. This is one of the hardest parts to swallow about the Old West. The justice system simply didn't have a separate category for minors. If a 14-year-old boy committed a crime considered serious, he faced the same court, the same jury, and the same sentence as a 40-year-old man. There was no juvenile court, no special consideration for age. In Texas and the Oklahoma Territory, There are records of minors receiving extreme sentences for crimes that today would be handled in a completely different way. And when the situation slipped out of the control of official law, things got even worse. In executions carried out by mobs, no one stopped to ask the accused person's age. If the community was outraged by the crime, the accused paid the price right there, whether he was 15 or 50 years old. The concept of protecting young people within the legal system only began to gain strength in the United States decades later, in the early 20th century. Number 13. In the Old West, there was a legal practice that very few people know about today. In regions where no penitentiary had been built, judges had to solve a basic problem: what to do with the convict. The solution was to hand the criminal directly over to the victim of the crime. That's right. If a man stole cattle or money from a rancher, the judge could sentence the thief to work for months on that same ranch without receiving a single cent. The convict basically became a temporary servant of the man he had robbed. Think about that for a second. The person who hated the criminal the most was the very person controlling his punishment. There were no guards, no government supervision, no clear rules on how to treat that forced worker. Everything depended on the property owner's temperament. A decent rancher might treat the man with dignity, but a vengeful man had a blank check to turn those months into hell. Justice handed one person total power over another, and no one monitored what happened after the sentence. Number 14. In 1876, Arizona opened the Yuma Territorial Prison and treated it as a step forward in the way criminals were handled. And in a way, it was. Because before it, troublesome prisoners simply disappeared. No one investigated. No one asked questions. So when Yuma opened its doors, territorial authorities celebrated. The place had written rules, medical records, formal procedures. And among those procedures was the dark cell. It was a chamber dug underneath the prison. No window, no decent ventilation, with temperatures that, in the desert summer, easily went past 110 degrees. They locked the inmate in there for days at a time in total darkness. The official regulations classified it as a disciplinary measure. 3 deaths were recorded by the prison's own doctors as a direct result of confinement in that chamber. And even then, no one questioned the method. Because the previous standard was so brutal that locking a man in a dark hole until he died was considered progress. Today, you can visit Yuma. The dark cell is still there. And when you walk down those stairs, you understand exactly what progress meant in the Old West. Number 15. In many American towns, the very people who were supposed to protect the population were the ones taking part in the violence. There are records of sheriffs who claimed they were not present during lynchings, but were later seen socializing with the organizers as if nothing had happened. In Texas, between the 1870s and 1890s, deputies were documented taking part directly in lynchings against workers of Mexican origin. And what happened to them? Absolutely nothing. No punishment, no removal from office. In January 1918, one case exposed this reality in a brutal way. In the small community of Porvenir, near the border, Texas Rangers executed 15 unarmed Mexican-American men. The official report classified the whole thing as a legitimate confrontation. It took a later investigation for the truth to come out. The Rangers involved were eventually removed from the force, but none of them faced criminal charges. The message left behind was clear. The law existed, but it did not apply the same way to everyone. And when authority itself crosses that line, who is left to hold it accountable? Number 16. The last public execution in the Old West. For decades, hangings were treated like community events. Entire families went to watch. Vendors set up stands near the site. It was almost like a fair, but in the late 1800s, something started to change. People began to question whether that was really civilized, and the territories started to act. The Arizona Territory was one of the first. In 1901, it banned executions open to the public. New Mexico followed the same path in 1903. Texas took longer. It only moved executions inside prisons in 1953. The last major public execution in the classic Old West format happened in Prescott, Arizona in 1901. Outdoor gallows, gathered crowd, everything the way it had always been. After that, it was over. But here's the detail many people don't realize. The system didn't eliminate the death penalty. It only removed the part that had started to bother society, the public watching. The punishment continued. It just changed location. It left the town square and went behind prison walls. Number 17. The Eighth Amendment had already existed on paper since 1791. It banned cruel and unusual punishment. Seemed clear, right? But here's the detail that changes everything. 19th century courts interpreted that rule in a way that would leave anyone today speechless. Dark cells with no light at all for weeks. Whippings on the back. Prisoners rented out to farmers and mine owners who treated them worse than animals. All of this went through the legal system and was considered perfectly acceptable. Judges looked at those conditions and said they did not violate the Constitution. The reasoning was direct. Once convicted, a man stopped having rights as a citizen. State courts openly declared this. The prisoner was property of the state, period. No one questioned it. And the United States Supreme Court? It stayed silent about the treatment of prisoners throughout the entire 19th century. The first real decision limiting what could be done to a prisoner only came in the 20th century. In other words, for whole decades in the Old West, the law did not protect those behind bars, and everyone knew it. Number 18. Riding the rail. Imagine being dragged out of your house in the middle of the night by a group of furious neighbors. That was exactly how riding the rail began. The practice worked in a brutal way. The men of the town took a wooden beam with the top sharpened into a wedge shape. The victim was forced to straddle that beam as if it were a horse, except the weight of his own body pressed the area between his legs against that sharp edge. 2 or more men lifted the beam onto their shoulders and marched through the streets of town. Every step meant more friction and more pain in an area that needs no explanation. The goal was never to kill. It was to destroy the person's dignity in a way they would never forget. Records show that many were left with permanent injuries that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. This was done to men accused of cheating on their wives, cowardice, or causing political trouble in the community. At the end of the ride, they threw the man outside the town limits with a clear warning that coming back would be worse. There was no trial and no defense. The crowd decided everything. Number 19. During the expansion of the railroads in the American West, there was a system very few people know about. Territories like Arizona rented prisoners out to railroad companies. In practice, it worked like this. The companies paid the territorial government an amount for each prisoner, and in exchange, they received labor for the sections no one else wanted to do. We're talking about work with explosives, digging through canyons, and mining in conditions that free workers refused. Records from the Arizona Territory between 1880 and 1895 show something that stands out. The mortality rate among these prisoners reached almost 30% a year. By comparison, in regular prisons at the same time, that rate was between 3 and 5%. When a prisoner died in an explosion or a collapse, the territory simply sent another one. Families received no notice about these deaths. The bodies were buried right there along the railroad route. Many of those lines are still in use today, and people who pass over them have no idea what lies beneath those tracks. Number 20. Solitary under the sun. In the American Southwest, the desert was more than a landscape. It was a weapon. In regions of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, There was a method of punishment that didn't need a rope, a knife, or a revolver. All it took was the sun. The person was tied to the ground, exposed directly to the desert heat, where in the summer temperatures easily went past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In less than 4 hours, the body simply stopped working. Ranchers used this against land trespassers, miners used it on rivals, and some people used it as a form of interrogation to force out information about stolen cattle or the location of fugitives. The most disturbing detail was exactly what made this practice so common. It left no visible marks, no cuts, no bruises, nothing that pointed to violence. When someone found the body, the conclusion was simple: heat stroke or dehydration, a natural death caused by the climate. No sheriff investigated it as a crime. The desert took care of everything and then erased the evidence. Number 21. Poisoning water sources. In the Old West, water was worth more than gold, especially in dry regions like New Mexico and Arizona. Controlling a water source meant controlling the survival of an entire community. And that was exactly what turned wells and springs into targets during land disputes. In the 1880s, historical records documented at least 30 cases of deliberate poisoning of water sources in those regions. The most commonly used substance was strychnine, which anyone could buy at an ordinary general store without having to explain anything. The goal was to force rival ranchers to abandon their properties. But the effect went far beyond the landowner. Workers, families, children, everyone who depended on that water was affected. The animals were usually the first victims. Horses and cattle died within hours. Then came the people. And here's the shocking detail. In most territories, poisoning someone's property was not clearly considered a crime. Of the 30 documented cases, not one identified person responsible was ever prosecuted. The law simply couldn't keep up with the brutality of that time. Number 22. Banishment, the punishment that was equal to a slow death sentence. Have you ever stopped to think about what happened when an entire community simply decided you no longer existed? In the Old West, there was a punishment that didn't involve a rope, a bullet, or a whip, but could be just as fatal as any of them. It was banishment. In religious colonies in territorial Utah, in immigrant villages on the plains, and in isolated mining camps, the community could vote to expel someone from social life. From that moment on, no one could sell that person food, trade goods, offer shelter, or even say a word to them. On the frontier, where there was no bank, no open market, and survival depended completely on cooperation between neighbors, that meant only one thing: slow death. Records from the time show cases of banished people who died of hunger or exposure to the cold because no neighbor was allowed to help. And the law did nothing because whoever was outside the community was outside any protection. It was a death sentence with no formal trial, no judge, and not a single drop of blood spilled.